prevention. All right, beautiful. Lots of richness in today's representation. So I see a question here. How do I get to the questions box? It should be in your doc there that will sign on. I actually have it in the screen right now. It should be an option somewhere on the right. It may be minimized right now, but it's called questions. So if you want to find that, and we'll have folks help you out as well. So already people are chiming in about a time they felt like they mattered, about their opinions being heard and listened to. Wonderful. Thank you all for sharing about who's with me this afternoon. I'll keep connecting back with you all. Feel free to keep typing in your replies. I just want to move on to thinking about today. And again, keep in mind about a time that you felt like you mattered, which is really critical to thinking about youth development and engaging youth. And so just to get us grounded, it's important to start with the definition of youth development, something that gets talked about a lot in very different ways, and it's important to always be on the same page about it. So there's two types of ways to think about youth development. One way is that, yes, young people develop, right, just like babies do, toddlers do, adults do, and elders do. So that's one way to think about development and youth development particularly. The other way that we talk about it here at Health Resources in Action is that youth development is an approach. And it's about, and you'll notice some key words here in this definition. It's about supporting youth that focuses on outcomes. So outcomes being skills, knowledge, attitudes, aptitudes, right? So all of those and then some that are necessary for young people to not just survive, but thrive today in adolescence and adult life based on their capacity, strengths, and formative needs. So one thing, a couple things I want to pull out from this is that we need to support young people to be successful today and into tomorrow, right? We do, and this may not be the people on the webinar, but I often hear adults say a lot of focus on tomorrow and when they're older and when they're an adult. I don't know many 15-year-olds who want to be 35, right? Because 15-year-olds are just trying to get to the next day at 15 and maybe just 16, right? And I don't know about you, but middle school was really tough for me, and thinking about college or even high school was something that was very abstract to me. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't important to be talked about, but it does mean that we need to support young people to feel good and successful today in order for that bridge to be strengthened whenever they land in adulthood. For a lot of us, it's a very different age due to many different circumstances. And that the final thing I want to say about this definition that I want you to keep in mind throughout this webinar is that we are an asset-based approach here. We believe that young people bring a lot to the table, capacities and strengths, and they also have different formative needs, meaning, you know, in terms of people referring to now the trauma-informed world. So this training is absolutely, and our content is trauma-informed. We do not lead with saying it's trauma-informed because that is a deficit way to think about how we work with youth. It is something that is important to think about young people, but we believe in starting with the assets first. So what do they bring? What's already a strength? And what do we need to keep in mind to support young people at different levels? So that's just one thing to get us started with today in this definition. And earlier I mentioned outcomes, you know, knowledge, skills, attitudes, aptitudes, etc. We have 12 here that we work on, and again, I keep saying we, Health Resources in Action is the organization. The BEST initiative is the project that has been training on this content for about 17 years. And the BEST initiative 17 years ago when it was funded nationally with other groups. The idea was that they brought youth and youth workers together, and they asked them, if there was a thriving and successful young person, what would they have inside of them that would make them so? So hence it evolved these 12 developmental outcomes. So not to be confused with developmental stages, which I referred to already, but developmental outcomes, unfortunately the skills that get the bad rap called as soft skills. I don't like using that term soft skills because it makes it inherently less important than hard skills, right? These skills that we're looking at on the screen are now being referred to more and more as agency skills, or what I like to call them as hungry skills. Young people who are interested in learning and growing, that they don't take less for an answer, and they keep thriving. So if you notice, we have 6 that are split under aspects of identity and 6 that are in areas of ability. There's no need to think about too much on why 6 are in this category and 6 are in another. It's just a way to group them. So it's just a caveat that I wanted to mention. And also to note that the outcomes, you know, most programs think that we're doing all 12 of them and we're doing really well. And what I like to say is you are not doing it really well if you're trying to do all 12 with young people. That is stretching ourselves too thin. The sweet spot that we say is 2 to 3 outcomes is what a program should be mainly focused on with young people. Noticing that a lot of these overlap, right? So if you're working on mastery and future and civic and social ability as 2 outcomes in your program, that also is related to responsibility and autonomy, and it's also related to self-worth and probably mental health. As we see, there's overlap here, but we say it's important to go a mile deep and an inch wide, not a mile wide and an inch deep when working with young people. One, so that we can do the work for them to gain these outcomes in an intentional way, in a way that it sticks, and also in a way that we can measure it. So if we are tracking way too many outcomes, it is hard for us to know where we're making headway. And one last thing I want to say about these outcomes is that how we know we're successful is when the young people carry these outcomes inside of them into the world, right? So it's not enough to say, hey, we work on employability outcomes with young people because we run resume workshops. A resume workshop does not guarantee that a young person will walk away with employability skills. It will maybe ensure that they can sit down perhaps for an hour and hear what you said. It does not translate into a resume that could be written well, understanding how to translate your skills onto a resume, understanding how to communicate your skills in an interview, presenting your skills in an interview, and that's just getting in the door. The second piece after that, which is major, is keeping a job, which is a big part of employability and also connects to all these other outcomes mentioned here. So just some things to think about in terms of developmental outcomes for young people. And to caution you, there's nothing wrong with doing 2 to 3 really well. In fact, that shows us that you're able to address the other ones along the way as well, even if they're not your primary focus. So I'll pause for a second. I'm not sure if people have questions or comments so far about the outcomes that I just reviewed. Again, not the main focus of today, but it's important for me to share some thoughts about it. So just some additional thoughts here on what is the youth development approach. Now again, I mentioned that it's an approach that we take on, so adults or youth workers, depending on the setting, and just some kind of basic tenets of the positive youth development approach that we train on, which is youth as resources, not recipients, so they do not just receive services, they are active people in the process, and that they're seen as resources. that also we're not here to fix them, but to develop them. We're not a deficit-based model here. We do not believe they're broken and need to be fixed. So it's good to name that. And also that by preventing problems, we don't by itself promote development. So oftentimes we engage in just talking about preventing problems with young people and don't focus a lot on what we want them to develop instead. For instance, I often say that my goal is not to prevent violence. That is a very minimum. My goal is to increase peace, and that's the next step after the preventing the problem. We have a question here from Morgan. My apologies. To your question, meaning, or my response to your question is whether there's a way to see other interactions of webinar participants. There is not. This is the limitation of this current software we use, but I will try to bring to life how people participate and what they share as best as possible. But don't worry, that is on our to-do list in looking into software that can allow us to see how people can engage and interact. So thank you, Morgan, for that great question. And please keep the questions and the comments coming in. So last piece here that I want to mention, and again, the big focus of this webinar today is that our belief in youth development is that youth need to be at the table, and they need to be active participants in whatever conversation or issue or strategy is being discussed. So, I'll elaborate more on that as we go along. You're welcome, Morgan, she said that. Thank me for responding, of course. All right, so just to name these, and these may be obvious, so I'll go through them pretty quickly. So benefits of engaging youth, right? So there's 3 different ways to think about engaging youth. So the benefits for the youth is that it promotes a rich cultural diversity, not just for those that are participating in the coalition, but also for the young people, right? Often young people have a very limited view on how they engage with adults. It's either with their family or parents or teachers or at school, and that may be just one way that they engage with adults, and they don't notice the many roles and active ways that adults really enhance our community, especially in positive ways. It also promotes choice and opportunity. So there's been lots of research that proves that by young people being part of solutions to problems that are happening in the society, it actually increases not just their participation and potential in that work, but also it has had positive impacts on their overall outcomes. So school and how they see themselves in the world, perhaps getting a job. It also ensures that there's relevance as well by engaging young people. They get to give input and ensure that, young people's input and perspective is represented. It also, by essence, by including a disenfranchised group such as young people, we are already, challenging forms of discrimination. For instance, not to pick on schools, I used to be a school teacher, but schools overwhelmingly engage young people. I mean, that is who they serve. But when you think about the groups that come together to decide when young people should learn, what time school should start, what time it should end, the kind of big pieces that are part of the school, young people are never at that table to discuss things that impact them so greatly, and it's such a big part of their life. So it's important to include them as much as possible because buy-in gets to be really big. And also it helps them stay involved, obviously. So the more they get to see reasonings as to why things do and do not happen, they will get a bigger part of the picture, right? And they get to either advocate for why things didn't go through or why things did. And just some benefits here for the coalitions in the community or your program or organization. It keeps adults engaged. I know the more I engage my young people, the more work it was for me, but the more beneficial it was to see them grow and contribute in the way that they did. It also helps us be successful in utilizing strategies in engaging youth, because it also helps us think about how we engage other constituents in the community as well. And you know, not surprisingly, the benefits here to the community, it's starting young people early in terms of being civically engaged, right? And yet, you know, we wonder why the older we get, the less we are involved in community work or kind of voting or any other social interactions. It's because we limit those opportunities at younger, well, actually not really. I mean, some elementary schools participate in mock elections, kind of falls off in middle school and high school, and then boom, they're 18, they have to vote, and they're not really sure how to engage in that sometimes. It's because we need to provide more opportunities for that. Also, by having young people at the table being active actors in community work, the other folks that don't get to know or work with young people get to see them in a way that they haven't seen before. So, you know, various ways that the community, the young people, coalitions, or programs benefit by involving youth. It's not at all easy, but the benefits of it, I think, outweigh the challenges of doing it. Sorry, I may have skipped. Okay, no, we're good. So I just wanted to reference this slide that came up in a webinar earlier this fall that Steve Radini led on multi-sector engagement, and that in order to do good community work, we need to engage all sectors of the community. So here's in reference to the vision for healthy communities for all, and we're highlighting that, you know, at the very beginning, full circle, we're talking about investing in youth leadership and development. It's something that's really important, not just because young people are our future, which they are, but because young people are living in the world and experiencing the world today, right? And who better to engage in solutions and thinking about strategies than young people. And then also, again, in reference to this webinar as well, you know, thinking about multi-sector partners, and you know, I'm sure you're all engaging all these partners in various ways, and youth and students have been there, and maybe we're thinking college age, and that's fine as well, but we got to think about the high school age young people as well and how we engage them. They're in school today, they're studying some of this information today. How much better than to make this information real by engaging them today in this work? Right, so just wanted to circle back on that and show you all the connections that we made so far. All right, so I'll pause for a bit, give you a chance if you have any questions. I'll keep going. All right, thank you all for those that have been chiming in. So, you know, some caveats or barriers that may be in place before engaging youth. Now, you may have experienced this already if you've already embarked on engaging youth. For some of you who are thinking about it, these are some considerations to keep in mind. I want you all to think about additional barriers too that you have confronted, but just wanted to name some basic ones here. One, location. If you're thinking about engaging youth into meetings or planning meetings, etc., we got to think about, is this a youth-friendly space? AKA, can they get to it? Is there public transportation? Is it accessible? If they need to get there by car, who is going to drive them? Or is it possible to have them picked up? Now, this may be really hard depending on the location. And absolutely, thank you, Diego, for chiming in. Safety is very critical. There was some youth work that I did in Roxbury, community organizing work with high school age youth. And it was important for me, and I was also told without knowing, you know, thank you, my young people kept it real with me and said, I don't go into that neighborhood. I have, you know, fights with young people in that neighborhood. I don't feel safe going there. So I don't prefer to go there. So anytime we had community outreach efforts, I made sure that I tactically, with the young people's help, divvied them up to go to communities that they felt safe and that they knew they can go to with no problems. I couldn't do that by myself because I didn't know all the dynamics in the community, so I really relied on their information for that. So we have to think about safety, and we also think about accessibility in terms of the second piece here, scheduling. If we want young people to participate, we probably don't want to schedule meetings while they're in school, right? Or while they have other commitments like a job. A lot of our young people want to do more work in the community, but they also have to pay for bills and help their family with responsibilities. So it's not because they're not interested. They may have other real commitments. And they may be taking care of siblings or their own kids. So we want to take into account their scheduling just like we do with adults, right? And sometimes I may just be asking them, right, what works best for you? And I also mentioned here the child care piece. And I think all these strategies are really great about engaging anyone in the community, but in particular, we want to think about these with young people in mind. Some other things to keep in mind before engaging youth, and you all are probably, way deep in this, but we have to create youth-friendly promotional materials, right? So youth-friendly could be very colorful, not too many words, more pictures. And this, I'm giving it away a little bit, but if you're doing a flyer for young people, maybe you want young people to create the flyers. That's a great way to engage your audience. And also, I like to go to the basics about any effective flyer, that it's the who, what, when, where, why. How can we keep this as simple as possible so that young people understand the purpose of meetings and what they're asked to attend? And again, I mentioned that as well. You should understand what's expected of them before they're asked to participate in things. Highlight what's in it for them. And again, these may be helpful tips in engaging everyone in your work, but again, it's good to be reminded. And promote it in places where youth are, and use social media. Now, promoting in places where youth are, of course, young people are in schools. I've embarked on lunchroom presentations in the past while I've gotten permission from the school administration to present about a particular initiative for young people. I've gone to basketball games. I used to work in Roxbury, like I said, which is part of Boston here, and I used to stand outside of a train station, Roxbury Crossing, that had a majority of young people at that station more than anywhere else. Forest Hills also was another place. And I used to just stand out there with flyers with other young people. It made me more relevant, right? So these are just some examples of ways that we can find young people and not expect them to find us. And also, this isn't always something that may apply to your work, but sometimes young people can't get engaged in your work if the parents aren't on board as well. So with high school age, it depends. We want to work on their leadership and independence skills. So, it's touch and go on whether we want to include parents. Not that they shouldn't be involved, but we want to support young people to take onus of involving their parents. But I have also done my good share of parent engagement. So I made sure they knew whether young people were at that evening. They knew who to contact if they were trying to track them down. And also, so I have an ally, especially if that young person had to present to the city, on a big hearing, and maybe their picture was going to be in the newspaper. So eventually those things may happen. So it's good to start parent involvement and engagement early on. And social media is here as well, and it depends on whether your group or your programs are on social media. That alone needs its own webinar on how to use social media effectively. But again, some of the same tips on how to engage youth apply here. Keeping it short, keeping it succinct in terms of what message you want to send. But also, if you're promoting on social media, you want to make sure that young people are actually seeing it. So if all your friends are other organizations or adults, unless they will help you get the information to young people, social media may not be the best outlet unless you have nieces and nephews and godchildren who are part of the program who are willing to share the info for you. And then there's nothing wrong with that. My niece has thousands of friends on Facebook. I will never be that popular, but if I need her to get information out, she will do that for me. Got to work on our allies. Some other final, I think I have 5 final tips here on engaging youth. Now, take this with a grain of salt, like everything I shared today, but this one in particular. One, I mean, food, I think food is a minimum at the very level. I think it helps engage everyone, but I know budgets are a challenge and it's not always easy for us to include food, but oftentimes young people go throughout their whole day without getting a bite to eat or something nutritional, so they are hungry, starving, they are really just not in a good place after school or in the evenings or on the weekends when you're thinking about engaging them. So we want to think about food. I don't always think of that as an incentive. I think of that as a minimum sometimes, and of course it depends on how long you're going to work with them. But that's something to consider, and there's many ways to have local community vendors to donate food if you plan ahead in time. Also, you know, if you're going to engage young people over long term, so you want them to go to community meetings over time, you know, almost every high school young person has a volunteer or community service requirement in school. Let's take advantage of that. And again, young people do want to give back to the community. They're very idealistic and have a lot of great ideas. Having or getting income or a job is maybe preventing them from doing that, but they need those school credits in order for them to graduate. So that's a way to do that. And I've worked with many schools to give my young people credit for work that they've done in community meetings, etc. It really does help. And again, I mean, this may be a given, but it's important to remind young people that we are there to provide them college or work recommendations. That's at the bare minimum, that's our job as folks who work with young people. And I would tell you that a lot of young people don't even know that's an option, or they think we're doing them a favor when they ask us to do recommendations. Now that may be it, but I think it's a, you know, a requirement for me to do college or work recommendations for the young people, especially so I can help them already get used to asking for that when they do need a reference in the future. And then finally, if possible, and this one's even trickier, but stipends are a great way to think about keeping young people engaged or hooking them in. Again, why they won't participate in the first place may have something to do with needing money or income. But, you know, with all of these, but in particular the stipend, is we also want to balance not over-incentivizing young people for work that maybe they should be doing. So, you know, I don't know everyone's situation and how they engage youth. So I just wanted to mention these, though, as a reminder of ways that we could keep them engaged or even hook them in to begin with. So I will give you a moment there in case if you have any questions or comments so far. I have some additional considerations. Thank you, Morgan, for chiming in. Morgan typed in that this may not be viewed as an incentive, but your availability 24 hours a day and when they need to talk is also an incentive to youth. Not that you have to, but being able to call or text when needed. And thank you for bringing that up. I think, one, yes, being available to young people, being an additional adult in their life that they can come to for questions or issues, that is an immense, immense added value in their life. However, the youth worker trainer in me also wants you to think about self-care and a balance, and I know you all perhaps think about that quite a bit in your work, but you know, it's important for me to also ask folks who work with youth to think about, you know, what's okay for you and what isn't. And there's nothing wrong to tell young people what your limitations are. But if we are engaging youth, we got to know, obviously, that they're young people all, 24 hours of their day. So they don't stop having issues or questions when programming the meeting ends. So we have to try to keep it balanced. And maybe, no, you can't call me at 10 p.m., but you can text me and I'll respond the next day when I'm available, or here goes my email, or text me, and again, I'll respond to you when I can. So thank you, Morgan, for agreeing, but I do believe that by being available to young people, it is a huge asset to them and a huge asset to us, right? I know I've learned a lot by being there for young people and supporting them in things that are outside of the program or the coalition expectations, because that may prevent them from deeply engaging as well, which is part of the purpose of this. So it's and both. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about these additional considerations. So these are some practical tips to keep in mind, especially if you're engaging young people in a meeting, an event, but I'm thinking more of a meeting with adults in different ways. So if you're engaging young people for the first time, or you're engaging them little by little, I always ask folks to engage at least 2 young people, okay? Now, engaging 2 young people means you don't have just the one young person representing all young people in the world, right? Then we do get to that level of ickiness, because they feel a lot of pressure. Am I representing my people well? Is this okay? I'm poking fun at it a little bit, but we want young people to not feel alone and to have allies. So at least 2 young people, and I'll talk a little bit more about youth-adult partnership, that's more than at least 2. It has to be at least an equal number, but just something to think about. When you're engaging young people, you want to be clear, what is the role of the young person? If there's a voting mechanism in your meetings, can they vote? Does their vote count? Do they get a chance to talk in these meetings? And we have to be cognizant of who is dominating the talking space right now. And if young people are not given explicit permission, and I'll talk about this in a bit, explicit permission to share their thoughts, they will often stay back or not share because they're in a space that is typically for adults, or perhaps they don't feel that comfortable in. So we have to be clear about the role of the youth, and if you're not clear, I ask people to be transparent about it, that you're figuring it out along the way. And that's okay as long as we're honest with them. And youth-friendly atmosphere, that goes along with that piece that I just said, but also, like, what's the space look like? Is it welcoming of young people? If it's a space you use often, then that probably has more applicability. If it's a space that you're a visitor in, it probably has less to do with what you're actually able to do. I think something else that's important to think about, a youth-friendly atmosphere. Again, I used to work in different youth programs, and I've heard adults who don't work with young people as much come to me and say, as the youth worker, when the young people come here, they don't ever say hi to me. They don't ever approach me. And I say, well, when you have guests come to your house, do you greet them when they come in, or do you expect them to walk in your house and just walk into your fridge or walk to your fridge and grab stuff? No, of course, right? We welcome guests. We say thank you and welcome to our home. And I ask people to extend the same courtesy to young people. If they're coming to your space for the first time, how are we welcoming them? How are we ensuring that they are welcome there, that we are there for any questions that they may have? And trust me, it will help break the ice and help them feel more comfortable. Communication style, and I'll talk about this in a bit as well. I have some communication tips coming up, so I won't delve into that too much right now. I think the last one that I want to give a little more info on is keeping young people at the table is a big commitment, and this goes for any stakeholder you're trying to keep at the table. The really busy CEOs and executive directors that have a hard time responding to your email and they don't respond to the whole email. It's the same idea. Young people spend a lot of their time in school. They're there really early. They're probably taking care of siblings. They're being told they need to get a job, or they need to, you know, they're being pulled in many different directions. So if you want to engage young people, we have to be active in keeping them engaged. That may be multiple texts, probably not emails. Not all young people look or respond to their email or have access to although they have access to phones. Whether they should be using it during the day while they're in school is a different issue. But we have to think about keeping them engaged, and that may take extra steps on our behalf to keep them at the table. That does not mean they're not interested. That does not mean they don't want to be engaged. That means they got a lot on their plate, and just because they didn't think to tell you they were coming late or not coming at all doesn't mean they're uninterested. It may mean many different things, right? So it's important to ask and also set the expectations with them as often as possible. Sorry, I skipped one. No, I didn't. All right. I mentioned this a bit already, but wanted to go into it a little more. Oh, great question, Morgan. I'll get to that in a bit. Asking for suggestions on developing friendly and environment atmospheres when you have little time to turn a room around, for instance, in a school. I'll get to that in a bit. I wanted to go through this, but also if anyone has any suggestions they want to type in on how to make a space youth-friendly that you are a visitor or taking over really quickly, you could type on. But just wanted to get through this slide and the next one before we jump into youth participation. Core principles for working with youth. We've probably, I've probably mentioned these already a lot, but it's good to be reminded. We need to listen to young people. Now, really listen. How is your day? And actually waiting to hear them respond and perhaps saying a little more about how did that go? How did that make you feel? It's just giving a chance for young people to feel heard. And Morgan, this may be getting to just making the space or helping the space be youth-friendly. Even the way we interact with them, if it's a space they have been in all day, if this is a way that they have been engaged with differently than they were during the school day, for instance, that already changes the dynamics. So I've had young people perform in ways in the after-school programs where the in-school teachers were blown away. They just couldn't believe that was, John from earlier in the day, because he never does that. Well, I said he does it in our program, and it's due to different ways that we interact with him. Also, in terms of communicating with youth, stopping yourself from taking over, I will give you the tip that if you ask a question, and this is of anyone, but if you ask a question, count to 10 seconds, maybe 15, get to know who the person is. They may need more time, but give them a chance to respond, and if they're young people are doing something, give them a chance to do it. Try not to take over. And again, I'll elaborate more on encouraging opportunities for leadership, but that obviously is the whole goal of engaging young people in your work. Holding high expectations at the very minimum about what you expect of them, even if at first they don't seem like they will perform, but it's still important to keep those expectations high. Exercising understanding and being patient, that's a given, but again, important to mention. And again, I have spent a lot of time with young people and a lot of time with adults who work with youth, and I understand if people are not comfortable working with young people or not sure what to do with young people. Be authentic, be yourself. That's what young people want. They want people who are real, who are authentically themselves. They don't want you to be quote-unquote cool or try to act like young people. Leave that to the young people. Be yourself, be caring to them, and be understanding, and that will go a long way, as well as having fun, which is in relation to Don's comment here to Morgan's question about creating friendly spaces. Icebreakers are always a good way to start off, allow youth to get up and move instead of sitting down and being lectured. We have to change the context that young people are in. And again, this is not to speak badly about teachers or in-school staff. They are just under a lot of pressure. So if we can even just change the ambiance of a space with young people, that's better than any visual you can add up, especially for a space that isn't your own or things that you have to keep switching off. Add some systems, some habits that really make the environment fun, makes it friendly, and makes it open. And those are some very minimum on how to make spaces youth-friendly. So I said I wanted to share some communication tips here. Some of these I have already mentioned, but some I want to elaborate a little bit on. Sorry, I'm reading the question. Sorry for the pause. Really good question. Are these ideas applicable to all youth regardless of race and ethnicity? Are there some things you can share about your experience with diverse youth? Thank you for the question. Yes, these tips and the ones that I'll continue to share are applicable to all youth, right? When young people are listened to, when we give them a chance to speak first, when we encourage them to step up, and that we believe in them, that they can make mistakes here, that we just want to have fun. That applies to all young people, absolutely. I think, of course, there are some caveats, not caveats, but things to think about with young people who are living in challenging situations, maybe have experienced a lot of trauma. But again, all those things that we're looking at here, core principles, at a minimum should be happening for all young people. Now, the level of participation we may expect in terms of attendance or how often they should show up, we may need to be a little more lenient depending on what we know is on a young person's plate, right? So if you know, yes, and it does apply to all ages too. Some less than others. If you have really young people, we have to think about engaging their parents in different ways because they're often very involved the younger they are. But it's important, though, sometimes there's issues in young people's lives that prevents them to participate in things consistently. Now, that doesn't mean we should lower our expectations of them, but I know that, there was a young person that I had whose family had a hard time paying for their light bill, and he used to, before I knew about the situation, he used to show up late to the program quite a bit, and we had talked about it. And then there was this one time he was late, and I said, hey, this has happened so many times, what's going on? And he alerted me to the light issue and not having lights to be able to get dressed and know what time it was to get up there. He did not have a cell phone. So, I respected and valued his perspective, and I appreciated him sharing that really intimate information. And I just said, how can we find a way for us to be on the same page and communicate? Because he did want to be on time. He did want to be there. And the issues why he wasn't there wasn't always in relation to that light issue, but it was important for me to keep that in mind. So it's definitely a balance. Communication is big, right? So this is why it's important to keep these in mind. So I have done this plenty of times. I've had to check myself about preconceived notions of young people. That example I just brought up, I just assume they all have access to lights in their home and can do homework in a space that is conducive to that, or that they can get dressed. That is a notion that I assumed what was happening with young people, or vice versa, that young people, when they look straight in the eye at me when I'm presenting or when they're answering every question I ask, that's engagement. Now engagement looks very different for everyone, and in particular young people as well. So it's important to take a step back and try to learn who the young person is without assuming we know what they're about. I mentioned number 2 already, but we got to make time in our meetings or events for young people. So that may be giving time specifically for young people to speak in agenda, Or that maybe that you ask a question and you ask youth to answer first. That's okay too. You want to notice your vocabulary use. Are you using really big words? We want to check ourselves. We learn a lot of big words in undergrad and grad school to then have to unlearn them when we work with young people, not because they're not smart or they don't get it, but because we have to keep this information accessible to everyone because we don't know if English is their first language, etc. Check in with them always, right? Make sure you're on the same page. Ask open-ended questions, not yes or no. Asking them questions in a calm manner. And don't be afraid to be wrong and admit it when you are. We often give young people the perception that we are perfect, and that is, you know, something that we have to struggle with as adults to project that. But I'm saying, one, you don't have to be, and two, you can certainly be honest with young people. Like, I made a mistake. That was my fault for not doing that or saying this. You know, how can we move forward? So that's really relating to the respect and understanding, and also being clear about your parameters and what you can do. Don't promise what you cannot deliver, and that may be something that we have to keep in mind, right? So yeah, give us your idea about that thing. We'll make sure we do it all, and we may not be able to do that, and it's okay to be really honest. I know we have some questions coming in. I'll probably save them for the end, just so I can make sure I get to this really important piece of the presentation. So, levels of youth participation. All right, so this is a framework that we use for thinking about engaging young people. For some of you, this may be familiar. You may be looking at it for the first time. We borrow this framework from the Northern Ireland Youth Council, which is a council in Northern Ireland that engages young people to make decisions not just about issues that affect youth, but issues that affect everyone in that country. So this is also dispelling the myth that there's such a thing as youth issues and adult issues. Now, yes, there are certain things that impact youth more than they impact adults, but all young people are impacted by issues that affect elders. Young people are taking care of their grandparents, or they're being responsible for helping the family pay for things that helps the elder grandparent or elder aunt, uncle, or, you know, vice versa. Young people do not grow up in a vacuum. So we have to think about all these things that impact people, and that young people are definitely part of that as well. So when you're looking at this chart, these are different ways that we can think about engaging young people here. So all the way from the left, there is none, and it goes all the way to self-managing. So I wanted to go through each one to talk about some examples. And while I do this, I want you to think about and reflect, how are you engaging young people? How do you want to engage young people? And I want to give the caveat that, one, although I am idealistic and I would prefer youth that are being engaged or youth programs to always be at self-managing, but that's not always realistic, right? So if you are at none and you're thinking about engaging young people in the tokenism level, and I'll talk about that in a bit, there's nothing wrong with that, right? That means you're moving a little more to the right. And one thing I want you to think about as I go through this chart is that do not think of a whole program or a whole component of your meetings on this chart. You got to take a piece of it, and I'll go through some examples of that now. So in the first level here, so the level referred to as none, this is young people are not included. So an example is, and I mentioned this earlier, yes, I am cool. I know what young people want. Yeah, I'm going to create a great flyer for them, yet I am not a young person, right? So perhaps I'm going to create the flyer because I have the software and I have the time. Why can't young people give feedback to it? And if you have young people involved all the time, why can't they create it, right? I go through levels of feedback loops in my organization, even though I know how to create products and flyers. But it's good to have different perspectives. Same thing here. But if you're creating flyers or any products for young people, how are they being engaged? And do they have input? Now, again, if you have no youth input on anything, on something that you are thinking about engaging young people, where can we start to move it more to the right? So this is where we get to tokenism. Adults set the agenda and make decisions. One or two young people may be consulted or visible, but their views are not necessarily considered. Now, there's absolutely two ways to think about tokenism. Tokenism is that one, ethnic person representing their whole community. Yes, that's a way to think about tokenism. This one is saying that adults are setting the agenda, making decisions, and they may not want to. That may be the way it's set up. So an example is meetings involving youth with little time for youth to give input, right? So we mean well, we invite them, we say, everyone in the meeting, give us your thoughts, yet we don't stop to ask young people, particularly for their opinions, even though we know this is their first time there. Maybe they feel shy to present, or maybe we don't know that, maybe we forgot. So we got to think about that. And the tokenism piece, too, the way it's traditionally defined, is that we do want to involve at least two youth. So if there's an all-adult setting that you're thinking about involving youth, please start with just at least two youth. It makes it easier. This young person has some other young person that they can connect to about questions or challenges, and it could be young people from any background. I would just ask you to engage the youth from the constituency that you would need, either the neighborhood, whatever issue you're trying to get to, etc. And I'll go through some examples of different ways that young people could be involved. Then there's consultation. As you see, we're going further to the right. The power of the youth worker or adults, you can think about it that way, is getting smaller, and the power of youth is getting bigger. So consultation is adults consult young people within adult parameters. An example of that is that there is an event that's set for the summer. This usually happens when you have to write a grant, and you have to put the date in there because you got to get money through the grant. And there's a theme that's selected, but the content isn't set yet. So it's like, healthy living in, Boston, that's the theme, but you don't know what's going to happen yet. So you can engage youth to fill in the content and add ideas to the theme with final adult approval. So that's a way to think about consultation, right? And again, this isn't willingness or you don't want young people to be engaged. This may just be the way that it's set up. So I always say if the intention is you want to engage youth, then that's a great place to start. So these are just different ways to get there. I have had many examples like this where I have had to set the date or had to impose a parameter, and I engaged youth voice and choice as much as possible, and I made it very clear to them that the final approval wasn't even me, it was my director's director. So, as long as they are kept in the loop, I find that young people are pretty understanding. Another level here is representation. So there are a select number of youth put forward for their peers in collaboration with adults. So an example of this is 2 to 3 youth are selected to speak on behalf of the program or project at site visits or events. Sometimes youth advisory boards are under the representation column here, because what if you're engaging 40 young people? It's hard to get every single young person's input when there's that many. But if you had a smaller advisory board or committee of youth that represented that group, that's definitely representation, and maybe even more participation, but I'll talk about that as well. But if you're thinking about engaging youth, you have a really big group or their attendance is spotty or, etc. Can engage 2 or 3 of them. Again, that's better than none. It's better than tokenism. It's better than consultation. Engage them, ask them their opinions, and do it with them, okay? Not that they bring up an idea and then you decide. This is really something that you're both thinking through together. And it moves us closer to participation. And again, after representation, we're getting into the sweet spot of youth engagement. And sorry, it's not our choice that participation is under the level of participation framework here. We didn't create it, but something to think about. So youth set the agenda, decide on issues and activities, and they have joint accountability with adults. And we like to call this youth-adult partnerships. So this is when youth and adults have equal decision-making power. So it's a youth group with adults. So that may mean that the number of youth and adults is equal. Come up with a messaging for a community campaign and determine how the messaging should be shared and when it should take place. So here's some examples. And again, I'm talking about levels of youth participation. I'm going to talk about forms in a bit now, which is why I'm going a little fast here. Just wanted to give you a bit of this context. And finally, kind of the utopia, the highest level of youth participation or engagement is self-managing. Youth work with little or no adult authority. So this, as an example, a youth group creates a survey, they design the plans for survey distribution, they interview survey respondents, they develop the presentation to present back the survey results. Now, there may be times that young people are not ready to do that. You don't know if they have that skill. So how do you set it up? How can you think about that? Or how do we get young people or youth groups to get to this level? Well, glad you asked. Here's how. But I'll give you a chance to ask any questions now or comments. I may not get to them all now. I may leave them for the end or respond via email. But I want to delve into the forms of youth participation. So this is the how, right? So there's levels, at what level they're engaged, and the how will get us to get them engaged even higher. So there's choosing, and here's some examples. They choose activities on how they participate. They're making decisions, decision making, right? And it could be from what snacks should we serve next week to, you know, how should we start the meeting for the mayor next month? What's the first activity? Planning, they can be engaged in planning and either meetings or future programs or community activities, many things. And also assessing, right? So it may be hard to engage young people in decision making or choosing or planning, but at the very least, let's ask them, what did you think about that event? What did you think about the meeting? Or asset mapping, which is another great way to engage young people. Communicating as well, having people, and that's how you know too what they're taking away with them, is having them present to outsiders, tours, presentations to funders, an actual activity or introduction in your meeting. It's a great way to gauge what they're walking away with. And obviously, last but not least, they're implementing, right? So they're leading things, they're doing things, they're presenting workshops, etc. Absolutely. Alyssa made a comment that these ways of engaging young people is ways we can engage everyone. Yes, it does work. And again, we want to think about the considerations and caveats that may be in the way of young people being involved, but that doesn't mean that they can't get to these levels. So I want to give you some specific examples here and some things we want to make sure we have in place. Engaging youth in your coalition. They may be choosing questions to include on a survey, for example. They may be deciding on the appropriate messaging for flyers or for social media. They may be developing the appropriate outreach approach for spreading the word on events or doing the asset mapping, like I mentioned. Communicating, they may be writing a letter to their local official on a pressing issue, and they can even present that letter at a hearing. They can also lead workshops on the topic that you're addressing, substance abuse, healthy eating. So again, a lot of these are really important ways to engage the community at large, but when we're thinking about young people, and this may apply to all communities, is what may be some skills, knowledge, or training that they may need. So again, a lot of these are going to repeat with other examples that I bring up, but they may need training or knowledge on the topic area that they're doing, knowledge on how to research and design research questions, how to properly frame flyers, how to use social media, how to do outreach methods. And presentation and public speaking and facilitation skills. They may need help on how to figure out how to administer surveys. They may need some context as to what the purpose of asset maps are, why it's important to network and do an elevator speech, and learning about the built environment, how to write letters, and then workshop design and organization. So these are a lot of things, and I'm not saying you have to take all of this on. It may just be as simple as asking the young people, what do you know? What are you coming to the table already able to do? And the way that you actually know whether they can do it well is you test it out, right? Here, make this flyer. I need it by this day to give feedback. Let me know how it goes. If we don't do it in time, I may need to take over, right? So this is where the intention is good to involve young people. Reality may make it hard, so we have to fall back to more adult input. There's nothing wrong with that. But I just wanted to mention these pieces because we may already be thinking about engaging young people at these different levels, but we may not have the systems in place to do it. I know some of you asked about how to engage young people in your community health assessments and community health improvement processes. Now, a lot of the examples I mentioned in the last slide can be applied here. Here's some ones that may be more specific to CHAWS and CHIPS, or SHAWS and SHIPS. Is young people can choose the topics, themes, and priorities. They could be part of these conversations on best strategies to include community voice or the planning process. They could be the ones planning how to get community input, right? So selecting food, setup, etc. Young people can be given their input via feedback form on the effectiveness of a planning meeting. They can also present back themes from a small group planning discussion. Young people can engage their peers in a planning process. So, you know, I've been in CHAWS and CHIPS, and it's hard to get every stakeholder at the table that in theory gets paid to do this work or is really invested, let alone young people who are in school and have a lot of things. So I do want to name and honor those challenges. But it is important, it is possible to engage young people at all levels in health assessments and planning processes. We do have to think about creatively on how to engage their voice and their input. So when in doubt, assessing, right? So if they were not part of planning meetings, but there is a summary of what was discussed in a particular theme or topic, present it to them. Ask them, what do they think? Is there anything that they want to add, right? And the implementing could be whatever that they learn from the process they can present to their peers. So there's so many different ways that we can engage young people. It's never a question if we should engage them or how we can engage them just like we do adults. We just may need to think about what skills or knowledge or training they may need. And again, a lot of this repeats from before. What kind of knowledge do they need on the topic? Do they even know the purpose of CHAWS and CHIPS? Do they know the knowledge of the community's needs? Like, this community has high rates of obesity. For a lot of people, they don't even know that, right? Knowledge of budget, planning meeting structures, outreach efforts, and again, public speaking and workshop design. You may have other young people who are really awesome at a lot of this, and they can teach their peers on how to do this. And then finally, the last example that I have that I'll go through a little more quickly is engaging youth in leading an event. This is another great way that's a one-time thing, kind of, that engaging young people in different ways. They can choose the venue, the food. They can decide on the agenda. They can plan outreach and marketing strategies. They can give their input on components that they aren't involved with. So again, they may not be able to be at the table due to availability all the time, but it's important to engage them when you can, or ask them for their feedback if they weren't able to give input on something. And also, they can present the purpose of the event or lead icebreakers, and then they can also help with cleanup or setup, etc. So again, some things that you may need to keep in mind about skills or training that they may need. A lot of these I mentioned. And then there's some additional ones there for your consideration. So wanted to mention this tool for a little bit and have you reflect on it. So, and this is a tool that I mailed out for you to think about. Now, on the left there, it has the forms of youth participation. I reviewed some examples of them, choosing, decision-making, etc. On the top, those categories can be adapted and changed to what you think makes the most sense for you, right? So if you're thinking of engaging young people in your coalition or your program, maybe you want to engage them in governance of your coalition or program. So how you engage them could be the forms. Also planning meeting design, right? So maybe you engage them in planning the meetings that you bring them to, right? They can take a lead on leading activities, etc. Levels of involvement, that's just a category to have you think about the different ways that you can involve them at any given point. Day-to-day decisions. Now again, you may not have them every single day, but when you do, you can do a little rundown of, here are the different things I need to make decisions on, what parts do you all want to give input on. And then community outreach and engagement, I brought up a lot of examples about that. And then coalition and program evaluation. So that may be that they are given input by giving their feedback, and maybe that they're helping you develop the instruments to garner feedback. So perhaps you wordsmith a little later, but they tell you this is what we want to hear from participants. So, you know, this is meant to be something that you fill in. You can fill it in on your own with other program staff. You can also fill it in with the young people and ask their input. And, you know, I'll ask you now, too, if there's different ways from what I've reviewed, and I know I've gone really fast, if there's something that you are thinking about involving young people or inspired to do, or things that you're still questioning in terms of involving young people, I'll give you a chance to type in those questions now, or any comments in terms of here's how I engage young people and here's how I plan to bump it up, aka here's how I plan to have more youth input, more youth voice, more youth choice. So I'll give you a chance to reflect on that and type it in. You're also welcome to email me, and I'll share my email at the end if you have any questions or thoughts that come up for you in terms of how you're engaging youth or any barriers you're coming across. Awesome. Awesome. So I have two great questions on the table here that I wanted to address a little. One was engaging young people in a summit. That's wonderful. Alyssa, I'd be happy to talk with you about it, how to engage young people in event planning or anyone. Something that I've done quite a bit and would love to give some thoughts, especially if you're doing it for the first time. I also have another comment or question about introducing a lot of new things in our program, and the returners are kind of like, whoa, slow it down a little bit. I would say it's great to think about what could work better and start to apply things that you can do on a better scale, but we do want to think about how we're rolling it out, right? And are we thinking about the young people, right, and how they're receiving it? I would say if you're definitely rolling out a lot of new things, or at least if that's your assessment, check in with the young people often. This may be on a weekly basis, and maybe in person, what did you think about X, Y, and Z, and maybe via anonymous feedback form so that they can feel comfortable giving you feedback without feeling bad about it. It may be that you ask another adult who's not their direct adult to ask them what they think, so that they have different manners in how they give productive and helpful feedback. And then, awesome. Karen is thinking about having young people design publicity materials and facilitate outreach. Young people are great at this. I would say some are naturally better at it than others and than adults. I've had young people design T-shirts in ways that I never even thought was possible. You never know unless you try. And if you build in a feedback loop and a draft loop and all that stuff, it will all go well. Same thing for me. I need a feedback loop so I can share with my colleagues about what do you think about this? How does this design look? But I would say don't be afraid to ask young people, have you tried this before? Would you be willing to do it? Great. Let's embark on it. Awesome ideas, y'all. I'll share this, Ben. I'll keep rolling in with the questions. We're at the end here, so don't worry. I'll be ending on time. Just some reminders here about building relationships with youth, because this is the most important. You may not have the best program in the world. You may not have thought of every single thing, but young people will be more forgiving and more available to you if you think about and implement the following things. One, provide structures for one-on-one interaction. Are you getting a chance to check in with young people on a one-on-one basis, even if for 15 minutes? How are things going? What could go better? How can I support you more? Allow time for team building. Icebreakers and games are there for a reason, not just to have fun. Fun is great too, but also it's to build team, to break the ice, to get them to trust you and trust each other. Allow time to get to know them and listen. You can do that through one-on-one and through the games or just being with them. Allow them to be creative. And this may be when they try out the flyers or the T-shirts or the outreach. I'm like, oh, I never would have talked to that person that way, but that's really interesting. Let's try it out. And again, allowing room for mistakes, and that's big. Oftentimes, this mistakes that young people make, especially during school, are really high stakes, right? They do something wrong in an exam, and that's it, they fail, right? But here, if they design a flyer in a funky way, or if they, in a role play, talk to a community member in a not productive way, you can talk with them, or even in real life, and say, here's how could we have done this better, and actually engage them in that solution. But last but not least, I would say the most important thing when working with young people is you gotta have fun and laugh with each other. Take advantage of those opportunities to just sit back and get to know who they are, how their brain works. Trust me, I have learned a lot that way, and I think they learn a lot that way as well. And also, Melissa added one more piece about something she's thinking about presenting to the youth council. Awesome, and getting more people in the group. Keep thinking about this, keep rolling it out. And one more thing I would say about whenever you're introducing new components to your programming, don't be shy. Ask the young people, especially if you have young people already involved in some way, what do you think about me rolling it out in this way? You know, ask a couple of them to get different perspectives. And also, don't be afraid to take it incrementally too. That doesn't mean that you're preventing from change to happen. It means that you're thinking about it intentionally and you want to do it well so that it sticks. But along the way, asking for feedback from the young people, from other adults, from everyone involved, would make it that much better. You don't have to do this in a silo. You don't have to do this alone. There's so many new things I debuted in my youth programs or working with young people that I included them in along the way. What do you think? And they're like, oh, that didn't go that well. I'm like, thank you. What didn't go well? What do you think could go better? And we would just engage in a very great, awesome conversation about it. So that is it for engaging young people. I know that's more than that, but at the very minimum, ways that you can engage young people. Feel free to keep typing in your questions now. You can also email it and send it to the Training Institute through our various methods. I wanted to bring your attention to, again, some things that are coming up in the future, again, provided free to you due to generous funds from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. If you're thinking about communication tips and tools to strengthen your impact, this is thinking about your whole work, not just about tips for young people, but again, that's something I'd be interested in checking in with you about. but maybe you may find that topic helpful, so come check it out, May 26th. That's a webinar. And then there's 2 in-person trainings that are left this year that are in Dorchester and Boston, building coalition capacity and infrastructure, and sustainability and resource planning, things that you can think about for the end of this year as you're moving forward to planning next year, if you're on this kind of fiscal year. And again, there goes our website, hrainstitute.org. I want to thank you for your participation, your questions, and your comments this afternoon that have been very helpful. Other ways that you can engage with us, email me if you have any questions or comments you want to continue this conversation. I'd be happy to do that. Check out our calendar on our website. Also, you can Twitter or tweet with us. As you can tell, I'm not a tweeter, so I'm learning the lingo. We're also on LinkedIn as well. And last but not least, I just want to tell you all, thank you so much for thinking intentionally and creatively about engaging young people. It is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I know it is not easy. So I appreciate everything you do in your communities and everything you're doing to engaging young people and bringing them to the table. It is all important work, and I wish you all the best of luck. So thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great afternoon.